For today's video, we're talking about fractions, decimals, and percents. So our learning target today is I can convert between fractions, decimals, and percents. Please write down the date that you're watching this video and write down what you already know about converting between fractions, decimals, and percents. And then we have no vocabulary today. So pause the video here, make sure you get all that written down, and start when you're ready. So over the course of our video today, we are going to be creating a diagram, a little picture to help us with the rules we're going to be learning. And this diagram is going to be in the shape of a triangle. So draw a triangle right at the start, and we're going to be talking about how to convert between fractions, decimals, and percents. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to go from a fraction to a decimal. So let's say we had the fraction 1/5. If I want to turn a fraction into a decimal, all I have to do is divide. So my rule is just to divide. The numerator divided by the denominator. That's the top divided by the bottom. Remember that a fraction bar can also mean divide. So in this case, 1/5 would just be 1 divided by 5. If I do that on my calculator, I get 0.2. If I have a mixed number, such as 4 and 2/3, I would do the same thing. I would do first just the 2 divided by the 3, which equals 0.6, repeating. But because I have this 4 as my whole number, my actual is 4.6, repeating. That 4 is just the number that goes in front of the decimal. So on my diagram here, if I want to go from a fraction to a decimal, all I have to do is divide. So here on our little diagram, we're just going to put a little divide symbol with the arrow that goes from the fraction part of the diagram to the decimal part of the diagram. Now, if I want to go the other way, if I want to go from a decimal to a fraction, let's say we had this number here. All I have to do is I have to say the number out loud. In this case, I would say that this is 0 and 2/10. Well, 2/10, that immediately sounds like a fraction. That would be 2/10, 2/10. The other way I can do this is I can put a 1 under my decimal point and then zeros under everything after it. In this case, I get the same thing, and I will always 2/10. Now, I always want to make sure that I simplify. In this case, I would simplify by 2 and get 1/5. Please remember to always simplify your answers. Unsimplified fractions will always be marked as incorrect on quizzes, tests, assignments, everywhere else. If we have a number with whole number parts, so for example here, if I were to say this number out loud, I would say that this is 4 and 55/100. So my number is 4 and 55/100. Again, my other option, if I'm not really strong with the place value and saying the numbers out loud, I could put a 1 under my decimal and then zeros under everything else. And again, I get 4 as my number in front and then 55/100. As always, I want to make sure this is simplified. Here I see that 55 and 100 are both divisible by 5. So my final answer would be 4 and 11/20. And that is dividing both the 55 and the 100 by 5. So to go this diagram, my rule is just to say the number aloud. and that takes me this way on my diagram. Now, again, if I don't like that say aloud, I can use the 1 under the decimal and zeros under everything after rule. Now let's say I go from a decimal to a percent. To go from a decimal to a percent, my rule is very simple. My rule is to multiply by 100. So for example, the decimal 0.2, I would do 0.2 times 100, and I would get 20%. This is easy to remember because the word percent literally means per 100. Percent. So if you think about cent, that could be there's 100 cents in a dollar. There's 100 years in a century. Cent is a word or part of a word that means 100. So it's really easy to remember. To turn a decimal into a percent, we multiply by 100, and then that gives us our percent. So 0.2 is the same as 20%. 4.55, we would do the same thing. 4.55 times 100, I get 455%. So to go from a decimal to a percent, on my little chart, all we do is times 100. And that takes us that way on our chart. Now, somehow this wasn't on your original sheet, so add this here. To go from a percent to a decimal, please adding that to your note sheet. To go from a percent to a decimal, going the opposite direction. Well, to go from decimal to percent, we multiply by 100. So to go from a percent to a decimal, we just go backwards. We divide by 100. So for example, if I had 40%, I would do 40 divided by 100, and that would get me 0.4. That's my decimal. 3%, we would divide by 100, and we would get 0.03. Even if there is a decimal in my percent. So for example, 0.25% is still a percent. So even though there's a decimal within the percent, to get rid of that percent sign, I still have to divide by 100, which would get me 0.0025. So coming back up to our diagram, to move this way, divide by 100. And that's to go from a percent to a decimal. To turn a percent into a fraction, we just have to remember that percent means per 100. If we can remember that, then turning a percent into a fraction is really easy. 20% means 20 per 100. 20 per 100 as a fraction would just be 20 over 100. As always, we would want to simplify this. There's lots of ways to simplify it. One way would be to divide by 10 on the top and bottom, which would give me 2/10, and then divide by 2 on the top and bottom, which would give me 1/5. So my final answer for what 20% is as a fraction is 1/5. If I have a fraction or a percent such as 115%, that would be 115 per 100, which would be 115 over 100. Here I'll divide by 5 on the top and bottom. That gives me 23 over 20, which is an improper fraction. To turn that into a mixed number, I get 1 and 3 20th. That would be my percent as a fraction. So my rule here to go from a percent to a fraction, just that we do the percent over 100. Then finally, the last thing we want to be able to do is go from a fraction to a percent. So let's say I had the fraction 1/4. To turn a fraction into a percent, remembering what percent means. Percent means per 100. That means I want to know what this is over 100. Now I recognize this. This is a proportion over 100. Okay? Now that I have a proportion, I can solve this. So to solve this proportion, I need to get from 1 to this question mark. So I want to know how many times 4 goes into 100. Well, 100 divided by 4 is 25. So 4 times 25 is my rule down here. And so I need to do 1 times 25 up here. 1 times 25 is 25. So my answer is 25%. The second way to do this, if you don't like that way, or let's say you get a number that doesn't work nicely, say 3/8. If you have 3/8 and you want to put that into 100, well, if I do how many times does 8 go into 100? Well, I don't know what that is off the top of my head. I'm going to have to use my calculator and a decimal. 8 times 12.5 equals 100, but now I'm starting to do something that's a little harder. On the top, I can do 3 times 12.5, and that gives me 37.5%. However, the other way to do this is to say, okay, if I have 3/8, I can turn that into a decimal by dividing. 3 divided by 8 is 0.375. Now I can just multiply that by 100 and get 37.5. Either one of these methods is going to get me the answer. So my method that I'm going to write over here is the method of the numerator over the denominator equals the percent over 100. Really, either one of these methods works, and it just depends on whether you're happier using the proportion or whether you prefer to turn it into a decimal and then into the percent from there. Please use these notes to help you with the problems. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a great day.